I survived abuse from my father, my husband, and my boss. 3 men, 3 different stages of my life, 3 kinds of prisons. But it only took one woman to break free. Me. That's how I'm starting this conversation with you. Not with softness, but with truth. Because the pain we hide behind pretty words keeps burning inside. And today, at 70 years old, I've chosen to hide nothing. My name is Kate Ellis. I was born and raised in Albany, Georgia, in a house that smelled like old wood, stale coffee, and fear. The creaking of that wooden house at night haunted me more than any nightmare. Those creaks weren't just the house settling, you know. Sometimes they came with heavy footsteps, slammed doors, or the held-in breath of a little girl who wished she could disappear. My father was a well-respected man in our town, very religious, always wearing a pressed suit and a wide smile. But inside our home, he was someone else. No one saw the way he gripped my arm tightly just because I left a glass out of place. No one heard the muffled yelling he called correction. He said he was teaching me discipline, but I didn't need discipline. I needed love. My mother? Quiet. Always busy with dishes, sewing, or hanging clothes out on the line. She seemed to live in a world where pretending not to see was safer than confronting the storm. And from her, I learned early on how to swallow everything. My words, my tears, even my voice. I remember one night in particular. I must have been about 10 years old. The kitchen light was still on. The smell of burned beans lingered in the air because my mother forgot them on the stove. My father came home irritated. He tossed some papers onto the chair like they had personally offended him. Then he looked at me and said, in that low voice that froze my spine, "One day you'll thank me for making you a real woman." At the time, I didn't understand. But my body did. My stomach turned, my skin crawled, and my soul went into hiding. I grew up hearing that women should be submissive, that questioning was a sin, that silence was a virtue, and for years I believed it. You know when you think that if you just stay quiet, maybe everything will pass more quickly? That was how I lived. In school, I was the quiet girl. Good grades, hair pulled back, eyes down. They called me polite. But it was fear. It was survival. At 18, I thought I'd found my way out. His name was Richard Carter, a handsome guy with green eyes and messy hair who worked at the local auto shop. He told me I had the sweetest smile he'd ever seen. That was enough to make me believe he was different. I married him when I was 19. And at the altar, when he held my hand, I thought, this time, it's going to be different. But what I didn't know was that I was trading one prison for another. I was still a prisoner, just with a new warden. That part of my story I'll tell you in the next moment, not to build suspense, but because I want you to walk this road with me, piece by piece. I don't want to shock you. I want to show you that survival can also be tenderness, and sometimes survival becomes strength. If this grandma's story is touching your heart, leave a like. It really helps the channel and shows that you want to hear more true stories like this. Subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories. And if you know someone who needs to hear something like this, share it. Sometimes one simple story can turn someone's whole day around. Thank you for being here and listening with your heart. I married Richard Carter in the summer of 1968. It was hot that year, the kind of heat that clings to your skin even at night. The kind that makes you sweat just standing. Still. I remember the scent of gardenias from the little bouquet my mama managed to put together. I remember my shoes pinching my toes, and the white dress that didn't feel like mine. But what I remember most, painfully clearly, is how hopeful I was. I really believed I was escaping. Richard wasn't a monster, not at first. That's how it always starts, I suppose. He was kind when people were watching. He'd bring me flowers from the gas station or open the car door for me. People called us the sweet young couple. But at home, the charm cracked quickly. He didn't like when I disagreed. He didn't like when I spoke up. He especially didn't like when I cried. And he made that very clear. I was barely 20 when I found myself walking on eggshells again, just like I had as a little girl. One night, maybe a year into our marriage, I had overcooked the meatloaf. Not burned it, not ruined it, just overdone. He slammed his fork on the table and said, "You're just like your mother. Can't get anything right." That sentence hit harder than his voice, because I knew what came next. Not fists, no. Richard never hit me, but he didn't have to. His words did the damage for him. It was the slow erosion that got me. The comments about my body, my cooking, my intelligence. The way he told me, constantly, "You're lucky I married you." As if I owed him for saving me from my father's house. And I believed him. For years. There was a moment I still think about, over 50 years later. I was standing in front of the mirror in the tiny bathroom of our first apartment. My hair was wet, my eyes red from crying, again, after another one of his silences that could last for days. And I looked at myself and whispered, "Is this it? Is this what I escaped for?" I didn't recognize the woman in that mirror. She looked smaller, duller, like someone fading in her own skin. We had a son, Ethan, when I was 23, and for a little while things felt almost normal. Richard smiled more. He held the baby and told me I was a good mother. I clung to those moments like a raft in a storm, but storms always come back, don't they? When Ethan was about 5, Richard lost his job at the factory. That's when the tension turned into control. He didn't want me to work, but we needed money. I started sewing for neighbors and baking pies to sell at the Saturday market. He hated that. Said I was making him look weak. That I was trying to be the man of the house. I stayed for 12 more years after that. Not because I loved him. Not even because I was afraid of him, though sometimes I was. I stayed because I didn't think I could survive on my own. He made sure I believed that. But something inside me started shifting. Quietly, slowly, like a seed cracking underground. I started keeping a notebook. Nothing dramatic, just small things. What he said, how I felt, what I wished I could say back. It wasn't a rebellion, not at first. It was a whisper to myself that I was still alive inside, that my thoughts mattered, even if no one heard them. And then one night, Ethan, who was 17 by then, stood between us during a fight. Richard was yelling, and Ethan stepped right in front of me and said, "You don't get to talk to her like that anymore." It was the first time someone had ever defended me. Ever. That night, I packed a suitcase. It took less than 10 minutes. I didn't even take all my clothes. I just took what I needed and the notebook. I looked Richard in the eye, and for the first time I didn't flinch. I said, "I'm not yours to break anymore." Ethan came with me. We moved into a small rental house across town. It was old and drafty, and the hot water ran out fast, but it was ours. And in that house, I laughed out loud for the first time in years. But my story doesn't end there. I thought I'd finally stepped into freedom. I thought the worst was behind me. What I didn't know yet was that the next man I'd trust, my boss, would become the third link in this chain of abuse, and I would have to break it once and for all. The little rental house where Ethan and I moved was nothing fancy. A sagging front porch, peeling white paint, and a patchy lawn that refused to grow no matter how much I watered it. But to me, it was a palace. It smelled like fresh air and chipped wood, not fear. And the silence inside wasn't heavy. It was peaceful. I found work at a small law office in downtown Albany. I wasn't qualified for much. No degree, no experience. But I could type, organize, answer phones, and smile. And for the first time in a long while, I felt proud walking out the door in the morning. I'd tie my hair back, put on my one pair of heels, and feel like I was stepping into the world again. That's where I met Mr. Bradley Moore, my new boss. He was about 50, tall, sharp suits, the kind of man who filled a room just by walking into it. At first, he was polite, overly polite even. He complimented my work, brought me coffee, asked questions about Ethan. I thought, he sees me. After years of being ignored or insulted, that attention felt like water on dry soil. Bradley started calling me darlin' and putting his hand on my shoulder when he passed by. At first I told myself it was just Southern charm. That's how people talk here, I thought. But deep down, I knew better. The touches got longer. The compliments got more personal. He once told me I looked too good to be just a secretary. One afternoon, I stayed late to finish filing. The office was quiet, just me and him. He leaned on my desk and said, "You're too smart for this kind of work, Kate. You deserve better. You know, I could help you move up around here." His voice was smooth, but there was something underneath it, a weight, a pressure. I laughed, nervously, and said thank you, trying to brush it off. But he didn't like being brushed off. The next morning, my desk had been moved, farther from the front, closer to his office. He said it was for efficiency. He started calling me into his office for little things: paper clips, coffee, imaginary tasks. He'd close the door. He never touched me, not really. But his presence was suffocating. The way he looked at me made my skin itch. And yet, I stayed. Why? Because I needed the job. Because Ethan was in high school, and I couldn't afford to quit. Because part of me still believed that if I just stayed quiet, things would pass. But they didn't. They got worse. Bradley began hinting at promotions, raises, opportunities, always tied to time alone with him. I started having panic attacks in the break room. I'd sit on the toilet in the bathroom with my hands shaking, heart racing, trying to calm myself down before walking back out. One Friday, after everyone had gone, he asked me to meet him in the conference room. Said he had something important to discuss. I knew. Every cell in my body screamed not to go, but I did. He sat at the table, folder in front of him, smiled and said, "I've seen how hard you've been working. There's an opening for assistant office manager. It's yours, if we understand each other." My throat closed. The folder was empty. Just a prop. I stood there frozen, memories of my father, my husband, crashing into me like waves. And in that moment, something broke. Or maybe something snapped into place. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "I understand perfectly." And I quit. He blinked, surprised. "Excuse me?" I said I quit. I walked out of that room, trembling, my purse swinging on my arm, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. But I didn't stop walking. I got into my car, put my forehead against the steering wheel, and cried. Not from fear, from freedom. Because this time, I hadn't waited. This time I didn't flinch. I didn't freeze. I fought back. I went straight home and told Ethan everything. His face darkened with anger, but his arms wrapped around me in the kindest hug I've ever known. That night, I took out my old notebook. I wrote one sentence. "This cycle ends with me." And I meant it. But what happened after that? That's the part I never expected. The part where I stopped just surviving and started helping others survive too. The Monday after I walked out of that law office, I woke up before the sun. Not because I had anywhere to go, I didn't, but because I couldn't sleep. My body was buzzing, restless, still carrying the weight of the decision I'd made. I stood by the kitchen window, a chipped coffee mug in my hand, and watched the morning light stretch slowly over the neighbor's roof. The house was quiet. Ethan was still sleeping, and for the first time in years, there was no one I needed to fear when the day began. But freedom has a strange echo when you're not used to it. I kept waiting for guilt to creep in, or regret, or that voice in my head that used to say, "You're making a mistake." But none of that came. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was space. Just space. Inside me, around me. As if all the corners of myself that had been crushed under shame and fear were finally unfolding. That week, I did something I hadn't done in decades. I looked at myself in the mirror without flinching. Not just a glance, to check my hair. I stood there, in the bathroom, lights on. And I looked. The lines on my face told stories. Some I wanted to remember, others I didn't. The gray in my hair had taken over completely, and my shoulders had lost their posture from years of cowering. But my eyes were still mine, and they were awake now. I said out loud, to no one, "You're still here, Kate." I decided that day I wasn't going to hide anymore. Not from myself, not from my past, not from my voice. I started writing. Every morning. After Ethan left for school, I'd sit at the kitchen table with a spiral notebook and a ballpoint pen and just write. I wrote about my father's house, about Richard, about Bradley Moore. I wrote about the moments I'd never told anyone, moments I'd buried so deep I forgot they had ever happened. And with every page, I felt lighter. It wasn't pretty writing. It was messy, emotional. Some days I cried, so hard I couldn't finish a paragraph, but I kept going. Then one afternoon, I was at the library looking for a book on trauma. Something, anything to help me understand why I carried so much shame that didn't belong to me. And I saw a flyer on the bulletin board. Women's Support Circle, every Thursday at 6 p.m., all ages welcome. I took it down and held it in my hand like it might burn me. I stood there staring at it for a full 5 minutes. Then I folded it gently, put it in my purse, and walked out. I didn't go that week, or the next. It took me 3 Thursdays just to get in the car. But when I finally did, my hands shook on the steering wheel the entire drive. The group met in a church basement, warm light, folding chairs in a circle, a kettle of tea on a little table in the corner. There were 6 women there that first night. Different ages, different stories. But when they looked at me, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long time. Recognition. Not judgment, not pity, just understanding. I didn't speak the first time. I just listened. But listening was enough to open something inside me. The next week, I told my story. Not all of it, but enough. And when I finished, there was silence. Then a woman named Lena, about my age, reached over and held my hand and said, "You're not alone. You never were." I broke, in a good way. It was the first time I cried in front of strangers and felt safe. The first time I told the truth and wasn't afraid of what would come next. That night, I went home and wrote in my notebook, "Healing doesn't come in a wave. It comes in ripples, soft, steady, honest." I kept going to that group every Thursday. I made friends, real friends. Women who didn't ask me to pretend. Women who knew what silence felt like, and how heavy it can be to finally speak. I started reading about trauma, boundaries, resilience. I wasn't trying to become an expert. I just wanted to understand myself, to rebuild, to reclaim the pieces of me I had given away or had stolen, and something unexpected happened. People started asking me to share my story. First in the group, then at a community event. Then, somehow, I was invited to speak at a women's shelter downtown. The first time I stood at a podium, my hands trembled. But when I looked at the audience, women with tired eyes and hopeful hearts, I said, "If I could survive all of that, so can you." And they believed me, because it was true. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about becoming. The first time someone called me a survivor, I flinched. I was at a small conference for women in recovery. The event wasn't fancy, just a community center auditorium with creaky chairs, a few banners, and coffee that tasted more like water. But the women there, they carried something real in their eyes, strength carved from pain, stories etched into every line on their faces. After I shared my talk, nervous, vulnerable, still learning how to own my voice, a young woman came up to me, maybe in her early 30s, tears in her eyes. She took my hand and said, "You're such a survivor, Kate. I hope I can be like you someday." I smiled politely. I even hugged her. But inside, I froze. Survivor. That word echoed in my head all the way home. It wasn't that I didn't believe I'd survived. It was that surviving had never felt like a victory to me. Surviving had felt like holding your breath underwater for too long. Like shrinking so small no one could reach you. Like making yourself invisible just to stay alive. But over the next few weeks, that word stayed with me. Like a seed I didn't know had been planted. I kept going to the women's circle. I kept writing in my notebook. And I kept receiving messages from women, some strangers, some friends, who told me that hearing my story gave them courage to tell their own. That's when something clicked. Maybe surviving wasn't just about getting through. Maybe surviving was about transforming the wound, not ignoring it, not erasing it, but carrying it with strength. One night, I sat down with Ethan at the kitchen table. He was in his early 20s by then, working part-time at a mechanic's shop and taking night classes. He looked so much like his father in profile, but thank God he wasn't like him in spirit. I told Ethan I wanted to write a book. Not a bestseller, not for fame. Just a simple, honest book. My story on paper. He nodded. "It's about time," he said. Those 3 words unlocked something in me. Over the next 6 months, I poured my heart into that book. I wrote every morning at sunrise, every afternoon after dishes, sometimes in the middle of the night when memories knocked too loudly on my heart. I wrote about my father. Not just his anger, but how his shadow still lingered in my decisions. I wrote about Richard, about how I confused control with love. I wrote about Bradley Moore, how power can wear a kind face. But most of all, I wrote about the quiet moments when I began to rise. The way it felt to laugh without guilt. To sit at a diner alone and not feel ashamed. To say no and mean it. To look in the mirror and say, "You matter." When the book was done, I printed 10 copies at a local shop and handed them out at the support group. I expected polite thank yous. Instead, I got tears, hugs. One woman clutched the book to her chest and said, "I'm giving this to my daughter. She needs to know she's not alone." Word spread. More people asked for the book. A retired teacher offered to help me edit and format it for publication. A librarian friend arranged a small launch event at the local library. I showed up wearing a navy blue dress I'd bought from a thrift store, hands sweating, heart racing. But when I stood in front of those folding chairs filled with strangers, I felt something I'd never felt before. Peace. Not because my past was gone, but because it no longer owned me. When I finished reading a passage aloud, someone asked me, "Kate, how do you define yourself now?" I paused, took a deep breath, looked around the room, and I said, "I used to define myself by what was done to me. Now I define myself by what I chose to do with it." That night, I walked home under the stars. The wind was soft. The trees whispered above me. And I realized I wasn't just a survivor. I was a woman reborn. And the cycle, the one that started in my childhood, that nearly stole my life, that cycle was broken. By me. There's something sacred about speaking your truth out loud, especially after years of being told to stay quiet. After that night at the library, where I stood up and claimed my story in front of strangers, things began to shift around me. People I hadn't spoken to in decades sent me letters. Some handwritten, some typed, saying they saw the article in the local paper about my little book launch. Some of them apologized for not noticing what I'd gone through. Others shared pieces of their own stories. One woman wrote, "I used to sit 2 pews behind your family in church every Sunday, and I never knew. I'm so sorry, and I'm so proud of you." It was overwhelming, but in the best way. Suddenly, I wasn't just healing for myself anymore. I was becoming a mirror, a reflection for other women to see themselves in. And that's when I realized that my voice had become a light in the dark for people still living in silence. I started receiving invitations from schools, shelters, support centers, churches, even book clubs. People wanted me to speak. Me, Kate Ellis, the quiet girl from Albany who used to flinch at the sound of heavy footsteps. Every time I stepped in front of a room, I felt my heart beat fast. Not from fear, but from purpose. One of the most unforgettable moments happened. At a women's prison about 2 hours from my town. I'd never set foot inside one before. The metal doors, the echo of boots in hallways, the weight of invisible stories in the air. It all hit me hard. They brought in about 30 women, all in identical uniforms, different ages, different skin colors. But one thing tied them all together, that haunted look in their eyes, like they were still waiting for someone to say, "You matter." I told my story, every part, my father, my husband, my boss. I didn't hold back. When I finished, there was silence. Then one woman, couldn't have been older than 25, raised her hand and said, "But how did you forgive them?" Paused. Because the truth is, I didn't. Not fully. I told her, forgiveness is a choice, but healing doesn't depend on it. Sometimes forgiving yourself is the most important part. She nodded, and I saw something in her soften. Just a little. That moment stayed with me for days. Back at home, I sat at my kitchen table, pen in hand, thinking about all the women I'd met. The ones who cried after hearing me speak. The ones who held their stories inside so tightly they could barely breathe. And I realized something else. For years, I'd been surviving in silence. Now I was surviving out loud, and it was changing things. One afternoon, while walking through the farmer's market with Ethan, a woman stopped me near the honey stand. She looked nervous. Her hand trembled as she reached for mine. "Are you Kate?" she asked. "Yes," I said gently. "I just wanted to tell you I left him. My husband. After 22 years. After hearing you speak at the community center. I realized I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone." We both cried. Right there, between jars of jam and loaves of bread. She hugged me like I was her sister. Her savior. But I wasn't either. I was just a woman who finally told the truth. That night I wrote in my notebook, the same one I'd carried for years, now worn and bent at the edges. Telling the truth doesn't just set you free. It gives others permission to unlock their own cages. It was around that time that I was invited to speak at a statewide conference for women's wellness and recovery. I didn't think I belonged in something so official. I wasn't a psychologist or therapist. I didn't have a fancy degree. But they didn't care about titles. They wanted my voice. So I stood on that stage, bright lights, hundreds of chairs, a microphone in front of me, and I began the same way I began with you. I survived abuse from my father, my husband, and my boss. 3 men. 3 chapters. 1 woman. 1 voice. Mine. The room was silent. Then came the applause. Not polite. Not forced. Real. Thunderous. And for the first time, I let it in. I wasn't just a broken thing that survived. I was a woman who had risen from the ashes and turned them into something that could light a fire in others. I used to think strength was something loud, something you shouted from rooftops or wore like armor. I thought strong people didn't cry, didn't shake, didn't have bad days. But now, in this new chapter of my life, I was learning the truth. Strength isn't loud. It's steady. It's patient. And sometimes, it shows up when you think you've got nothing left. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I received a letter in the mail. Real paper, real ink, addressed to me in cursive that looked familiar in a way that made my stomach twist. I sat at the kitchen table, the soft patter of rain on the roof above me, and opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a single-page letter from Richard. Yes, that Richard. After all these years, his handwriting was still the same. Tight, slanted, like someone trying to hold too much emotion inside the lines. He wrote that he'd heard about my book, that he was surprised I'd written it, that he didn't remember things the same way, that he hoped Ethan was well, that maybe one day we could talk. I read the letter twice, and then I lit a match and watched it burn in the sink. Not out of hate, but because that page no longer had power over me. I didn't need him to believe me. I didn't need him to understand. And I certainly didn't need him to rewrite my story after I had worked so hard to reclaim it. That night, I sat with Ethan on the porch. The rain had stopped, and the air smelled of wet pine and earth. I told him about the letter. He leaned back in the chair and nodded. "You okay?" "I am," I said. And I meant it, because by now I had learned that healing isn't about getting everyone to agree with your version of the past. It's about standing firm in your truth, even if you're the only one standing there. The next few months were filled with speaking events, phone calls, messages from women I'd never met, but somehow felt connected to. My days were fuller than they'd ever been. But every now and then, I'd find myself sitting in stillness, remembering the girl I used to be. I'd think of her, the little version of me, hiding in closets, holding her breath, wondering if things would ever get better. And I'd whisper back through time, "It did. We made it." One day, after a speech at a local high school, yes, even teenagers asked me to share, a young girl came up to me. She had braces, a backpack slung over one shoulder, and tears brimming in her eyes. She said, "My mom goes through what you went through, but she won't leave. She says it's too late, that she's too tired." I reached out and held her hand. "You tell her this from me," I said gently. "It's never too late, and tired is just a sign that you've survived, not that you're finished." The girl nodded. I saw a flicker of hope light in her chest, the kind of hope I had once thought was gone for good. I went home that night and sat in my armchair, my old notebook open in my lap. The pages were almost full now, worn corners, ink smudges, my story in my own handwriting, but I wasn't done writing. Not yet. I began a new entry. Sometimes we spend a lifetime looking for strength, and then one day, strength finds us. In our voice, in our steps, in the quiet certainty that we are no longer who we were. The next morning, I made a decision, one I had put off for years. I would apply to become a mentor for survivors, not just a guest speaker, not just a voice on a stage, but someone who walks beside others, week after week, through the long, hard road of healing. Because as much as I'd come to love telling my story, I wanted to help others write theirs. So I filled out the form, typed my name, hit submit, and just like that, another door opened, not to escape, but to enter fully into who I had become. When I was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8, I used to lie in bed at night and imagine that there was a version of me somewhere in the future, older, braver, stronger, who would come into my room and whisper, You're going to make it. You'll get out. I never heard those words, of course. But somehow, I held on to that idea. That maybe, just maybe, the woman I needed was still becoming. And now, standing in front of a group of women every Thursday evening at the community center, sitting in a half circle of metal chairs and shared pain, I finally realized something. I had become her. Not perfect, not fearless, but real, steady, present. My first day mentoring was nothing like I expected. I thought I'd walk in with wisdom, answers, and calm authority. Instead, I was sweating, through my blouse and clutching my notes like they were a life raft. The women in the room varied in age, background, and pain. One had just left a violent relationship. Another was learning to speak again after years of emotional abuse. One woman sat in silence the entire time, arms folded across her chest, as if daring anyone to try and reach her. I didn't try to impress them. I didn't start with a speech. I simply said, "Hi, I'm Kate, and I know what it means to feel like your voice is locked away somewhere you can't find." There was a pause. Then someone exhaled, one of those deep, shuddering exhales that carries years of silence with it, and we began. Week by week, we shared stories. Not all of them were dramatic. Sometimes it was something as small as saying no to someone for the first time, or walking outside without fear, or sleeping through the night. And we celebrated every single one. Because healing isn't a mountain you conquer. It's a field you learn to walk through again, barefoot, scarred but still moving forward. One woman, Marlene, was in her 60s. She had spent over 35 years in a marriage where her words were ignored and her light was slowly dimmed. After 2 months in our group, she came in with a new haircut and said, "I told him I'm not making dinner tonight." I said, "Figure it out yourself." And then I sat down and read a book. The room exploded in applause, and I cried. Because I knew that moment, the first taste of self-worth. The first act of rebellion that says, I'm allowed to take up space. Another woman, Janelle, brought her teenage daughter one night. She said, "I want her to see women being honest. I want her to know we don't have to carry shame forever." We all shared our stories that evening, not just as survivors, but as teachers, as examples of what happens when pain meets purpose. After the session, Janelle's daughter came up to me and said, "I didn't know grown-ups got scared like this." I laughed gently. "We do, sweetheart. We just get better at walking through it." Later that night, sitting alone on my porch, I thought about how far I'd come, from that scared little girl in Albany, curled up under thin blankets, listening for danger outside her door, to this, a woman no longer hiding. I pulled out my notebook again, and this time, I wrote something not just for myself, but for every woman I'd ever met. The woman I needed back then didn't come from outside. She grew inside me, one brave breath at a time. The next morning, I got a call from a local counselor I'd met at the state conference. She said a university was putting together a panel on resilience in later life, and they wanted someone to speak who wasn't a researcher, but a real person, someone who had lived it. They wanted me. I almost said no. I thought, I'm just a grandma with a notebook full of pain and poems. But then I remembered Marlene, and Janelle, and the quiet woman who hadn't spoken yet, but still came to every meeting. I said yes, because being just a grandma is exactly why my voice mattered. Because no one expects a 70-year-old woman to walk into a room and set it on fire with truth. But sometimes, That's exactly what we do. The day I walked into that university auditorium, I could hardly believe where I was. The rows of seats curved around the stage like arms ready to hold whatever truth was brought forward. There were students, faculty, counselors, some my age, others young enough to be my grandchildren. But no one in that room knew my story yet. Not until I opened my mouth. I stood behind a simple wooden podium, microphone adjusted, glass of water to my right. My palms were damp, and my heart thudded in my chest like it used to when I heard my father's footsteps in the hallway. But this time, the fear didn't own me. I looked out at those faces and began. I was silent for too long. Not because I didn't want to speak, but because I was taught not to. Taught that survival meant staying small, invisible. But survival, I've learned, is only the beginning. The words came easier than I expected. I told them about the girl in Albany, the man I married at 19, the boss in the sharp suit who tried to steal my dignity, one polite gesture at a time, and I told them about the breaking point and the rebuilding that followed. I could see their eyes soften, some glistening, some staring with quiet awe. And in that room, I wasn't just telling my story. I was giving voice to every woman who had been taught that her pain was too much, or her truth was too dangerous. When I stepped down from the podium, they stood. A standing ovation. But more than the applause, what shook me was what happened after. A young man, maybe in his early 20s, approached me. He was tall, lanky, wearing a hoodie and jeans. He looked nervous. He said, "I wanted to thank you for saying it." My mom went through something like that. She never talked about it, but I think hearing you today will help me understand her better. That one moment made all the fear, all the trembling, worth it. Because healing doesn't just ripple through survivors. It echoes into families, into generations, into sons and daughters who might choose a kinder path because someone dared to tell the truth. After that event, the messages poured in faster. Emails, social media tags, voicemails on my old answering machine. Women and men reaching out from all over the country. Some had read my book. Others had watched a video of the speech that someone recorded. One woman wrote, "I've never spoken about what happened to me when I was younger. But after hearing you, I told my sister, and then my husband. And now, I'm going to tell my therapist. Thank you for being brave first." It brought me to tears. Because that's what courage does. It gives permission. Back at our Thursday support circle, something was changing too. Women who once sat in silence were now the first to speak. They laughed louder. They held their heads higher. One even brought cupcakes to celebrate the first year she had lived on her own, her first year of freedom. We were growing together, not as broken women, but as whole ones, remade. And while all this was happening, something shifted inside me. Something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from remembering and surviving anyway. One quiet evening, I was sitting on my front porch, a soft breeze brushing my cheeks, the sun setting in gold and lavender. Ethan came out with 2 cups of tea. He handed me mine, sat beside me and said, "You've helped more people than you'll ever know." I smiled and looked at him. This boy I once carried on my hip, now a man with kindness in his voice and wisdom in his eyes. "I didn't do it alone," I said. He shook his head. No, but you did it first. That night, I wrote in my notebook, one of the last pages now. When I spoke, I thought my voice would echo into empty space. But instead, it came back to me, multiplied, softened, and full of grace. This is what it means to rise. Not to forget the silence, but to break it wide open. And I slept deeply that night. Because for the first time in decades, I didn't just feel free. I felt whole. It's strange, isn't it? How a voice that once trembled with fear can one day fill a room with strength. How a life built from shattered pieces can become a blueprint for rebuilding others. There's a quiet kind of power in living long enough to see the seeds you planted begin to bloom. And at 70 years old, that's where I found myself. Not just living with my story, but living beyond it. That spring, I was asked to return to the university to speak again. But this time, not alone. They wanted to host a panel of women over 60 who had faced and overcome some form of trauma. I was the first name on their list. I helped them find the others. Marlene from our support group, Janelle, even Lena, the woman who first held my hand in silence all those months ago. We gathered in that same auditorium, and this time, I wasn't just a speaker. I was part of something bigger. When the panel ended, we were approached by a publishing group who wanted to turn our stories into a collection, a book written by women over 60 for women of any age. We called it Still Here, Voices That Survived. It became more than a book. It became a movement. Reading groups formed. Schools began adding it to their discussion lists. Counselors started using excerpts in sessions. And every time a woman held that book in her hands, I hoped she'd feel what I finally had, that her story mattered. And in the middle of all that, life kept happening, as it does. Ethan got married. I gained a daughter-in-law named Sarah, who quickly became more like a second daughter than anything else. She's warm, sharp-witted, and once told me, "Your story made me realize I don't have to apologize for my boundaries." I hugged her so tight that day I think I startled her. They gave me my first grandchild, a girl. They named her Hope. And when I held her in my arms for the first time, her tiny fingers wrapping around my pinky, I whispered, "You come from a long line of women who forgot how to be small." It was a sacred moment, because for every generation before me that stayed silent, I had finally spoken. And now, she would know a world where the truth wasn't a secret. It was a source of strength. Of course, there were still hard days. Healing isn't a straight road. Some nights, I'd wake up from dreams that pulled me back into the past. Some mornings, I'd stare at the mirror and feel that old familiar ache, that whisper of doubt, asking, "Did it really happen? Did you really make it out?" But now, I had an answer. I would walk to the bookshelf, take down one of the books I had written, and hold it in my hands. Yes, I made it out. And I built a bridge behind me. At one of our final group sessions before summer break, Lena asked me if I ever regretted anything. I thought for a long time before answering. Sometimes I regret not leaving sooner, not speaking up earlier, not seeing myself clearly when I was younger. But then I look at what came from the silence, and I realize maybe I wasn't ready to rise back then. Maybe the world wasn't ready to hear me. But when I finally did speak, it echoed farther than I could have dreamed. Everyone was quiet after that, not in discomfort, in reverence. because there's something holy about truth, especially when it's spoken by someone who spent decades trying to find it. As the sun dipped below the windows of that community center, and the shadows stretched across the floor like gentle reminders of the night, I looked around at the faces of women I had grown to love. Survivors, teachers, warriors. And I realized we weren't just survivors anymore. We were the storytellers, the torchbearers, the proof that no matter how long the night, dawn still comes. There's a kind of stillness that comes after a long storm. Not silence, no, not quite. But something else. A quiet that's earned. A peace that didn't come cheap. That's the kind of quiet I live in now. I still walk every morning. My joints ache a little more these days. My pace has slowed. But when I breathe in the cool morning air and watch the sun rise over the rooftops, I smile because I'm still here. And more than that, I'm whole. Sometimes people ask me what changed. How did you do it, Kate? They say. How did you break the cycle? And I always pause before answering. Because the truth is, it didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments, like the moment I said no and meant it. The moment I wrote my truth in a notebook instead of hiding it in shame. The moment I told my story out loud, even if my voice trembled. And most of all, the moment I realized that what was done to me didn't get to decide who I became. That power was mine now. I think often about that girl I used to be, the one who sat at the dinner table afraid to speak, who thought love meant obedience, who believed survival meant silence. I carry her with me, not as a wound, but as a witness. She saw everything, and still, she held on. She waited decades for someone to say, "It's over. You're safe. You can come out now." And now, I say it to her every day. I look in the mirror, wrinkles and all, and whisper, "You made it. We made it." I don't hate the men who hurt me. I don't need to, because they don't live here anymore. They don't own my story. I do. And that ownership, that authorship, it's the most powerful thing I've ever known. I wish I could sit across from every woman who feels trapped in her own life and hold her hands and tell her, "You are not crazy. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are surviving something you never should have had to. And surviving it doesn't make you damaged. It makes you remarkable." But if I can't sit across from you, let me leave you with this. You have a voice. Even if it's small, even if it shakes, even if you've never used it before, it's still there. And when you're ready, truly ready, it will rise up inside you like a wave that's been waiting your whole life to crash into the shore. It won't sound like anyone else's. It doesn't have to, because it will be yours. I'm just a grandmother now. I garden. I bake. I sit with friends and tell stories on porches while the sky turns orange. But every now and then, someone stops me at the grocery store. "Are you Kate Ellis?" they ask. I nod, and they smile, soft, grateful. And sometimes they say, "Your story changed me." But more often now they say, "I told mine because you told yours." And in that moment, I know. The cycle wasn't just broken, it was rewritten. We are not what happened to us. We are what we choose to become after it. And I choose to be free, to be loud, to be healing still, to be living proof that it is never ever too late to take your life back. So if you're hearing this, and your heart is trembling, and your chest is tight with truth you haven't spoken yet, let this be your sign. It's not too late. Speak. Even if it's just a whisper, that's how I started, and look where it took me.